me.
But the end of her marriage would not be pretty.
There's blood on the bed. He is struggling.
Her husband was laying there shot in the head.
I remember seeing pink foam coming out of his mouth.
At first, police suspected a home invasion gone terribly wrong.
Someone had evidently broke into the house.
But Darlene's own search for the murder weapon focused the investigation in a different direction.
You see Darlene with her blonde hair, and she is fishing, and she's fishing, and she's fishing.
If she knows the gun's there, then she's got to have been involved in the murder.
They had already had me set as the person that had done this.
November 9th, 2005. Shortly after 6 a.m., wife and mother of three Darlene Gentry placed a call to the Robinson, Texas 911 center.
Robinson 911, what's your emergency? I got up this morning. I was in my son's room because I didn't sleep. My back door was open. My husband's guns, they're all gone.
The break-in alone was unusual enough.
It's a nice rural area, and so it was bizarre that there would be a burglary there.
But then, 25 seconds after the dispatcher answered her call, Darlene made it clear she was reporting more than a mere burglary. Something was also wrong with her husband, Keith.
There's blood on the bed. He is struggling.
Her husband was laying there shot in the head.
He has pink foam coming out of his mouth. And he's making a god-awful sound.
I'm hollering at the kids to get out of the room, and because that was my primary goal. I didn't want them on him because at this point I had no idea what truly had happened. I get them out of the room, and as I'm trying to explain what's going on, and I know I was rambling.
The dispatcher directed officers to the scene.
We have a lady on the phone that is a possible break-in in her house, and her husband's been shot.
The squad cars en route. The dispatcher then tried to determine if the shooter was still on the scene.
You don't see anybody. I mean, like there's nobody around or anything, do you? I don't see anything. This back door was wide open.
Someone had evidently broke into the house and had left the door open and was trying to steal his gun or something.
Minutes into the 911 call, with Darlene still on the phone, the first officers arrived on the scene and found the missing guns.
I got a lot of guns here in the front yard.
The guns were found in the front corner of their yard, essentially, closest to the house, and they were neatly stacked.
A dying man, an open door, and a yard full of guns. To the officers at the scene, the pieces of the puzzle didn't seem to fit together.
The only thing that was taken were the guns, and then they were left right there in front of the house.
Within 7 minutes of the first officer arriving, he got on the radio and told one of the other officers, "This isn't right."
Something stinks about this. Something ain't right here, man. I'm telling you.
Darlene Doskasil and Keith Gentry met in their junior year of college.
Darlene and Keith met at Texas State Technical College, which is just a small little business-type college right here in Waco.
A former homecoming queen from the small Texas town of Cameron, Darlene was studying to be a dental assistant.
In all honesty, I did not have anything that I just was dead set that I wanted to do, except I knew I wanted to have a career. I hated my teeth, so I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll go into something of dental.
Keith, who grew up outside of Waco, was taking welding and drafting classes.
Keith was a fun, loving guy and liked to go out and joke around and have fun.
He loved hanging out with his buddies more than anything, but he also enjoyed fishing and hunting. He loved to hunt.
You could tell he very much was a people person as well, and he loved to be around people, and that's what originally drew me to him.
But it wasn't just Keith's personality that drew Darlene in.
He just had the most beautiful eyes. He was handsome.
By the time Darlene graduated, she and Keith had been dating for 8 months. But their future together as a couple was uncertain.
He was being a typical guy, wanted to still run and go and do, and I think I was more ready to settle down.
The couple broke up, and Darlene moved 100 miles away.
I said I can't handle being, because I loved his family, and I couldn't handle being around everybody
So I took off, went to Dallas, lived there for about a year.
She worked for this dentist until she got her car stolen in Dallas and decided to come home.
She also decided to come back to Keith.
Both of them liked to dance. They ran into each other at a dance and just started talking from that and got back together.
We were kind of happy that they did, sort of. You know, we liked Darlene. We thought she was good for him.
And this time, it looked as if Keith agreed. In 1999, after 3 years together, he asked Darlene to marry him. She said yes.
It was a typical Texas wedding. We did the barbecue for the, and the dance afterwards. It was a good time.
It was a great thing. I was glad to see him get married and settle down.
After the wedding, Keith took a job as a traveling electrician for an architecture firm. Settling into Keith's hometown of Robinson, Texas, the newlyweds built a house next door to Keith's parents and started a family.
They had 3 boys within about a 4-year period, pretty much back to back to back, which was, pretty stressful at times.
Darlene was also juggling a new career.
After the second baby was born is when Darlene decided to go to nursing school.
I realized once I got into it, that is what I would need it to do.
And if Darlene's new nursing career wasn't demanding enough, Keith's job as a traveling electrician kept him on the road 4 days a week.
He was gone quite a bit during the week. Darlene, I think, was pretty stressed out having to work, take care of, kids.
I mean, it was get up, take care of the kids, get them off to school, come home, cook supper.
Keith and Darlene only saw one another on the weekends, but they did make the best of it.
They went out a lot of times on weekends with friends and, the children when they had them. Well, we'd keep the kids while they went out.
We had a group of friends. We used to go out on weekends all the time together as, a group. And, husbands, wives, boyfriends, girlfriends, we all hung around and did a lot of stuff together.
In order to be closer to his growing family, Keith took a new job closer to home.
Keith needed to be with them, and especially being boys, that was going to be harder on everybody, raising 3 boys.
He took instead a job that was a daytime job, more of a desk job that he didn't really like.
The money wasn't great either.
And it was going to be a pay cut for him, but he was willing to do that, to be at home, with his kids.
But the fact that Keith was making less seemed to have little effect on Darlene.
She liked to shop.
She did like to look nice, and probably spent a lot of money on that.
She made sure the house looked nice, too.
Whatever she wanted. New dining set, new furniture, things of that nature.
Darlene's free-spending ways soon led to friction with Keith.
He told me she'll spend everything if I'm not there with her.
She had run up huge credit card bills, and that Keith had started getting phone calls at work about them.
Like many couples, they also disagreed about how to handle their children.
Didn't like the way she was handling the kids or when she handled the kids. She'd let them scream a lot, and that bothered him.
By 2005, after 6 years of marriage, the strain was showing.
You could sense a feeling that something was wrong between them. They didn't seem to be happy, and Keith wasn't happy.
We'd fight about stupid things. And if anybody says they have a perfect marriage, they're lying, because that doesn't happen.
And Keith's friends and family couldn't help but notice that instead of trying to make time for each other, the couple increasingly spent their free time apart.
Darlene had been leaving the boys with Keith's parents quite a bit, not just during the day when she was at work, but in the evenings too, and was, going out and partying.
Yet despite the marriage's downward spiral, Keith was determined to stick it out.
He was a great dad, great husband, a hard worker, and very loyal.
Keith had said to her and said to his family, "I'm not going to leave her."
And he never would, at least not by choice. Wednesday morning, November 9th, 2005. Darlene Gentry's father-in-law was already up and about well before sunrise.
I get up 5:15, 5:30 every morning without an alarm. It's just 7 days a week. I do that, and my first thing is I go outside and get my paper.
That particular morning, however, ᴅᴏᴄᴜᴍᴇ Gentry had barely settled in to read his paper before he realized the day's biggest news wasn't on the front page. It was in his front yard.
About 6:15 is when I seen the police cars coming down Keith's road to his house.
ᴅᴏᴜᴜᴜ rushed back outside and next door to the house Keith shared with his wife Darlene and their 3 sons.
Thought maybe a burglar or something had happened. And I walked over there and asked what happened, and they said, just stay in your own yard. And I said, well, that's my son over there. He said, I don't care, stay in your own yard.
While ᴅᴏᴜᴜᴜ Gentry waited anxiously outside, Darlene was inside the house, trying to reach Keith's mother on the phone.
I'm trying to get a hold of my mother-in-law because they lived right next door to us because I didn't want the kids in the house with just everything that was going on.
She called my wife while I was outside. She had called and was explaining the house was cool, the back door was open, Keith's gun was gone.
Keith's mother was ready to rush over, but Darlene told her mother-in-law that the police now had her and the boys isolated in a back room.
And my wife said, well, I'm gonna come get the kids. And she said, you can't, you have to go through the police to get them. She said, well, I'll go through them, but they wouldn't let you over there.
Darlene also told her mother-in-law that Keith was fighting for his life.
He was laying on his back, and I'm sorry. I remember seeing pink foam coming out of his mouth.
His yard was full of ambulances and police and fire rescue and people like that. And I'd heard one of them come outside and say, we've got him stable enough to transport.
I never got to see them take him to the hospital, nothing, because they had me barricaded basically in that room, didn't want me going anywhere.
Coming up, was Keith shot by an intruder?
You have any idea who this could have been?
I have no idea.
Okay, do you know which way they went?
No, I saw nothing.
Or someone closer to home?
They both got in my face and point blank tells me, I don't know what game you're trying to play. And of course I said, excuse me?
Wednesday morning, November 9th, 2005. Emergency units in the small town of Robinson, Texas responded to a 911 call from the home of Keith and Darlene Gentry.
Robinson 911, what's your emergency? I got it this morning. I was in my son's room because they didn't sleep. My back door was open. My husband's guns, they're all gone.
But Darlene Gentry wasn't just reporting a home invasion.
It appears that somebody might have broken in the house and shot the homeowner. There is an injured person there.
Arriving at the Gentry home within minutes, the officers made an unusual discovery just outside the door.
Got guns on the ground right here.
They were Keith Gentry's guns laid out on the grass.
You know, like a burglar had come, but he'd been scared away.
But what had startled the intruder? Based on what the police found inside the house, it wasn't Keith.
Mr. Gentry was still in the bed, had his head on the pillow.
He was barely alive, with a gunshot wound to the head.
There was an entry wound, but no exit wound.
The officers at the scene called for an ambulance. Then, with their in-car recorders still rolling, they asked Darlene a few quick questions.
You have any idea who this could have been?
I have no idea.
Okay, do you know which way they went?
No, I saw nothing.
And other than dialing 911, she hadn't done anything either.
They asked if she had done anything to try to help him, and she said no, she didn't touch him.
Moments later, the ambulance arrived. As the paramedics struggled to save Keith's life, the patrol officers hustled Darlene and the boys into the back bedroom.
Find a spot where you're safe at and let me clear your house for you, okay? Is this all your kids right here? Okay, let me go back here. Come back here with me.
Outside the house, ᴅᴏᴜᴜ Gentry watched anxiously while the paramedics loaded up his son.
We saw him taking him out of the house on a stretcher with breathing apparatuses on him, and that's when we really figured something was bad.
As the ambulance rushed Keith to the hospital, Lieutenant Tracy O'Connor arrived on the scene to lead the investigation.
Dispatch advised me of a home invasion break-in.
But if someone had broken into the house in order to steal Keith's guns, they hadn't gotten very far.
One of the first things that I observed was a stack of weapons in the northeast corner of the home that had been stacked outside the house. That kind of seemed odd to me.
The guns stacked outside were only the beginning of a long list of unusual circumstances surrounding the shooting. Dispatch may have initially reported the case as a home invasion, but there were no signs of forced entry into the house.
There was a door on the east side of the house that was open.
The burglar hadn't broken into the gun cabinet either.
It's got a glass front. The front of it wasn't broken. Whoever it was got the keys from on top of the cabinet and unlocked it.
And then there was the fact that Keith had been shot.
Burglar's not going to stay and shoot a person unless he's caught in the act.
Keith Gentry hadn't been found sprawled in front of the gun cabinet, however. He'd been shot in bed, a fact that had the patrol officers puzzled, if the chatter recorded by their in-car camera systems was any indication.
Something ain't right here, man, I'm telling you.
Hoping to shed some light on the situation, the police turned to their only witness, Darlene.
I asked if she would come to the police department to allow me to interview her to determine what their activity had been.
Once at the station, Darlene gave her account of the morning's events leading up to her 911 call.
I wanted to help, tell him anything that I could.
Darlene told the detective she had gone out the night before to see an old friend.
Miss Gentry had told me during my interview with her of her activity the previous night of going to meeting a friend of hers in a city about 30 miles away.
According to Darlene, she had gotten home between 8 and 9.
Her and her husband had discussed some money issues.
Keith and I sat down and talked in the living room just about normal things and, of course, money and everything else and what we need to do to, to get out of debt and everything else.
Although, as Darlene admitted, the discussion had started with an angry confrontation.
Someone called Keith at his office about a bill being overdue on one of the credit cards.
That's the one thing Keith is a fanatic about is his credit. And I'm the world's worst at it.
Faced with her husband's anger, Darlene said she had left him alone to cool off.
She didn't want to fight with him, and she just drove around.
Darlene told detectives that by the time she got back, Keith had calmed down.
They sat down and talked without either one of them getting angry. And it was more of an understanding between them.
He was very calm and just, hey, okay, this is what we've got. We need to do this. Do you have any, suggestions? I mean, it was a very, how you're supposed to have conversations.
The matter apparently settled. Darlene said she and Keith had gone to bed, but she hadn't stayed there.
Miss Gentry related to me that her children had been sick that night.
All three of the kids were up. I was trying to keep them quiet. We went off into my oldest son's bedroom. We were watching TV.
Before I do it, I was asleep, and apparently everybody else was too, until almost 6.
As Darlene explained it to the police, she was still in the boys' bedroom when she awoke the next morning.
Literally, him jumping on my head, the baby jumping on my head is what physically made me realize I'm already late. I need to get up, get moving.
Darlene said she had gotten the kids up and started their morning routine. But then Darlene said she had noticed their back door standing wide open.
I said, it's cold in here, and that's when I saw the back door open.
My first impression, it was me that did it because I'd gone out earlier in the night to throw away a dirty diaper. I thought I just didn't shut it hard enough.
And when I turned around, I realized the gun cabinet was open, and there were no guns inside of it. And so then I screamed at Keith, telling him those guns were not in the gun cabinet, that he needed to get up.
But Keith wouldn't get up.
Snores, so I kept thinking it just sounded different. It didn't sound like he always snores. So I flipped the light on in the bathroom, and when I turned around, I could see his stomach, like he was breathing with all of his muscles that he had in his abdomen. And then I realized that he had foam coming out of his mouth. And I tried to holler at him, told him Keith, and I kind of hit him. And didn't make any other noises than what he was already making. And then I realized I saw blood on the sheet. And then that's when I just grabbed my cell phone.
I don't know, I panicked.
A few minutes later, the first responders arrived and took Keith to the hospital. That was the last Darlene had seen of her husband.
She never once asked how he was doing at the hospital, never once questioned whether she could go to the hospital.
Darlene's lack of curiosity about her husband's condition wasn't all that the detectives found disturbing. Why hadn't Darlene, a registered nurse, tried to administer first aid to her husband?
I don't know if I was in a fog or I was in shock. I don't know what it was. I grabbed my cell phone and I turned it on, trying to call 911. I'm hollering at the kids to get out of the room, and because that was my primary goal. I didn't want them on him.
Darlene's answers struck the investigators as odd.
You know, even someone that's not trained in medical care, when their spouse is injured, they're going to try to do something to help that person. She made no effort.
Time was of the essence there. He was still alive and could probably benefit from some kind of help.
About an hour into Darlene's police interview, the hospital contacted Detective O'Connor with an update on Keith's condition.
The wound that he had sustained pretty much made him brain dead.
The investigator cut the interview short and drove Darlene to the hospital. Once there, Darlene joined the small crowd of friends and family waiting outside the ICU. Minutes after he was removed from the respirator, Keith Gentry passed away.
I never saw her actually really break down. She had tears in her eyes and mourned, but not like someone like that should have done.
The family was still gathered around Keith's bedside when Detective O'Connor stepped into the room and pulled Keith's father aside.
Detective Tracy come in there and told me that if you would, we'd like to see Darlene again. Once y'all are through in here, we'd like to take her to the office and talk with her some more. And I got a hint then that he had a suspicion about something.
Only hours into the investigation, police were already beginning to suspect that Darlene's story was just that, a story.
The whole story just didn't make any sense, and the fact that she says she hadn't heard anything, the house wasn't that big, and she said she didn't hear anything happen.
All the weapons that were in the house were supposedly taken out to the front yard and laid out.
No burglar's going to come and neatly stack guns in a row.
For Detective O'Connor, Darlene's behavior following the shooting raised a red flag.
Miss Gentry kept drawing the attention back to herself just by her demeanor.
And when Darlene returned to the police station after her trip to the hospital, it soon became clear the detectives weren't interested in finishing her statement. They wanted a confession.
They both got in my face, and O'Neill point blank tells me, I don't know what game you're trying to play. And I thought, and of course I said, excuse me? I basically said, okay, look, this isn't gonna work. And I said, I think I need an attorney.
Coming up, will new evidence add credence to Darlene's story?
The firearm was missing and was not at the house.
And will it lead to Keith's killer?
I said, aren't y'all missing the murder weapon? And he said, yeah. I said, you know, this don't seem right to me.
November 9th, 2005 was a long day for Darlene Gentry. A little after 6 a.m., she had dialed 911 to report that her husband Keith had been shot. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, Keith was dead, and she had been in a Robinson, Texas police station for nearly 2 hours, talking to homicide detectives.
That interview lasted from 3 o'clock till about 5 o'clock when she decided she didn't want to talk any longer.
Concerned that the detectives were attempting to pin the murder on her, Darlene had stopped the interview and asked for an attorney.
Initially, I thought they were just trying to find out what was going on, but that's not how it turned out.
Why would the detectives suspect Darlene?
If a person is killed and they're married and their spouse was in the house, then they're going to look at the spouse first.
There were also some things about Darlene's story that made her difficult to rule out. For instance, if a burglar had shot Keith in order to steal his collection of hunting rifles, Why had police found the supposedly stolen weapons piled outside the house?
Leaving everything behind that you'd killed a person for, it just didn't make sense.
The evidence that was collected at the scene, it just kind of started pointing back towards Miss Gentry.
However, even as the detectives were drawing their conclusions, new clues at the scene suggested that at least one of Keith's guns had been stolen. Checking registration records against the collection of guns in the yard, there was one weapon that the crime scene technicians couldn't account for.
It was a 9-shot, .22 caliber that Keith's father had given him.
The firearm was missing and was not at the house.
But why take that particular gun? The police had a theory.
We were concerned that the .22 pistol was going to be the murder weapon.
And they became even more concerned once the medical examiner completed Keith's autopsy.
The bullet was too badly damaged in his head to be able to match the bullet to the gun, but it was a .22.
But where was the gun? Over the next few days, police searched feverishly for a murder weapon and a motive.
You know, there weren't no skeletons in his closet. Appeared to be a good, hardworking man, close to his family, good father.
Friends and family weren't quite so kind to Darlene, however.
Everything was positive about Keith. Everything was negative about her, how she was never home. Rumors of her racking up the credit card debt.
A phone call to the Gentry's insurance company did point to a possible financial motive.
He had 2 life insurance policies, one through our Farm Bureau, and the other one was through his employer, and I believe it totaled around $750,000.
On November 27, 2005, the police went to a McLennan County judge and requested a warrant for Darlene's arrest on suspicion of murder.
The more they looked at her and maybe tried to eliminate her, everything just kept coming back to her.
I felt the strongest piece of evidence was the 911 call, because it just became obvious when you listened to it that you thought she was trying to set up the burglary.
The next morning, November 28th, Robinson police called Keith's parents and told them they were about to arrest Darlene.
It shocked us, thoroughly shocked us. Still believe she was innocent at that time.
Darlene insisted she was innocent, and family members were convinced the police were wrong. They even helped raise her $50,000 bail, and by that evening, she was out of jail. Keith's parents were so confident in their daughter-in-law's innocence that they allowed Darlene and her sons to move in with them.
She didn't want to stay over there naturally, and we had 100% belief in her that she didn't do anything, and so her and the kids stayed here.
Darlene spent the next several months living in legal limbo. She'd been arrested on murder charges, but it would take several weeks for the DA's office to firm up their case before they took it to the grand jury for a formal indictment.
This was a circumstantial case. It wasn't what I'd call a slam dunk. It was not one of these cases where you have a confession or a bunch of eyewitnesses.
And there was one piece of evidence the police were particularly anxious to find: Keith's missing .22.
We wanted the murder weapon.
Darlene, meanwhile, appeared equally determined to move on with her life. At the end of November, she contacted an acquaintance named Robert Pavelka, a local builder and real estate developer.
She wanted to buy a house if I had one for sale.
She was looking to move, not live in the house where the murder had taken place.
I didn't want the kids having to deal with every day about, just whatever. And so I didn't want them having that hanging over their head.
Robert told Darlene that he didn't have any homes for sale, but if she wanted to build one, he did have some property.
He told us where it was. The friends of ours drove me by so we could see.
According to Darlene, she immediately fell in love with the land.
It had been something Keith would have really wanted. It had huge oak trees. It was a beautiful place.
Best of all, it had a pond.
She called that next day and said, did the pond come with the land? I said, yeah, that's part of it. She said, well, that's great, because Keith always wanted a place for his kids to go fishing.
But when he met with Darlene to look over the land at the end of December, she had suddenly changed her mind. She still wanted the property, but not the pond.
We walked it, looked at it. She got ready to go. Then she said, well, you can take your bulldozer and push that pond in now.
I said, I guess fill it in. I said, because to me, it'd be safer for the kids.
But Pavelka became suspicious.
He knew who she was and what she had been accused of at that point.
That night, Pavelka called a friend in the police department.
I said, aren't y'all missing the murder weapon? And he said, yeah. I said, you know, this don't seem right to me.
First she wanted the water, now she doesn't want the water. My first thought was, as his, that she had thrown the weapon in the tank.
Foster immediately called in a dive team. On the morning of January 4th, they recovered a gun from the bottom of the pond.
They had a metal detector. They just walked out there and picked it right up.
It was Keith's missing .22.
We ran checks on it through the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms and determined that the weapon was Mr. Gentry's weapon.
The DA's office submitted the new evidence to the grand jury. And on January 11th, the McLennan County grand jury formally indicted Darlene for first-degree murder.
We knew that we had a strong circumstantial case. We felt like we had enough.
Coming up, when Darlene's case goes to court, the prosecution comes armed with more than just the murder weapon.
I said, you're not going to believe what we've got on video.
On February 6, 2007, Darlene Gentry entered the McLennan County Courthouse to stand trial for murder. The mother of 3 appeared confident, and she had her reasons.
I think she was kind of counting on the fact that here she was, this pretty blonde, mother of 3 young boys, and that, nobody would ever believe that she could possibly have done it.
You do not look at her and see killer at all. I mean, she looks like a mom, she looks like a nurse. She does not look like someone who would kill her husband.
Darlene didn't look the part, but according to the DA's opening statement, everything else about the case cast her as the killer.
The story that she told, the guns were taken from this gun cabinet, and it's got a glass front. The gun cabinet, the front of it wasn't broken. Whoever it was got the keys from on top of the cabinet and unlocked it and took the guns out, which, if you're going to kill a homeowner, just doesn't make much sense.
The murder was just such an extraneous thing to the burglary, and a burglary being committed while somebody was in the house and then leaving everything behind that you'd killed a person for. It just didn't make sense.
Then prosecutors claimed Darlene had carted her husband's guns outside, called 911, and started covering her tracks.
I got up this morning. I was in my son's room because I didn't sleep. My back door was open. My husband's guns are all gone.
It takes her about 25 seconds to say anything about her husband having been shot.
In my business, they call it basically burying the lead. She had to go into all this detail before she actually said my husband had been shot.
But was Darlene simply setting up her cover story as the prosecution claimed? The defense, in their open, argued that Darlene was simply in shock.
Just because I wasn't screaming at the top of my lungs does not mean that I wasn't worried about what was going on.
And, her attorney claimed, Darlene's stunned behavior had unfairly made her the sole focus of the subsequent investigation.
She was the only suspect that they ever focused on.
Their defense was, well, Robinson police had her nailed from the beginning. They just wanted to get her. They knew it was her. They never looked beyond Darlene Gentry.
Listening to the recorded of the morning of everything happened, 7 minutes into it, the initial guy already made the statement, something's not right. I know she did this.
The defense was at least partly right. Police had suspected Darlene of Keith's murder within minutes of arriving at the scene.
Something stinks about this, Gary. I think she did it.
But it would be almost 2 months before they nailed her. When the prosecution started laying out its case, the focus wasn't what Darlene had done on the night of the murder. It was what she had done in its aftermath. To explain, they called builder Robert Pavelka to the stand. The man who Darlene had contacted looking for land to build a house, Pavelka told jurors it wasn't just any land that Darlene had wanted.
The key thing why she wanted the land was the pond for her kids to go fishing.
The pond was key, That is until Darlene suddenly had a change of heart.
She wanted me to push it in, and that, I mean, she's going black to white, and something's not right there.
Pavelka testified that evening, he called a friend in the police department.
I just called him. I said, hey, it's probably nothing, but what do you think about this?
To explain how police divers had recovered Keith's missing .22 from the bottom of the pond, the prosecutors called Texas Ranger Steve Foster to the stand.
Probably 10 to 15 minutes after getting into the water, one of the divers found the weapon.
The only one of Keith's guns taken from the crime scene. Police strongly suspected that the .22 was the murder weapon.
The weapon Mr. Gentry was killed with was a .22.
And as the DA explained to the jury, recovering the likely murder weapon wasn't all the Rangers did. Working with Robert Pavelka, they devised a sting operation to hopefully erase all doubt as to who put the gun in the pond.
They thought there was a chance she might go out there and try to retrieve it if she knew that this pond was going to have to be drained before it could be filled in.
Because if the water's gone, you know, there's the gun sitting there.
And if she did, the Rangers had planned to be ready.
They sat up there with a video camera back there in the brush and waited.
In his testimony, the Ranger walked the jurors through the details of the sting, starting with the bait.
They told Mr. Pavelka to call her and tell her that he was going to drain the pond.
She got pretty shook up. You could tell it rattled her.
Not long after, from their concealed vantage point, the Rangers watched as Darlene arrived at the pond.
15 to 20 minutes or so go by, and then here she comes out again and gets in the Suburban and leaves.
Darlene's trip to the pond had been brief, but as far as the Rangers were concerned, it was more than enough.
I called Robinson Police Department and I said, you're not going to believe what we've got on video.
On February 8th, the prosecution played the surveillance tape for the jury.
You see Darlene with her blonde hair. I mean, you can obviously tell it's her.
She started digging around in the mud and stuff down there.
Not just anywhere in the pond either.
When the dive team retrieved the weapon, they left a stick. Actually, you can see it where it's sticking up out of the water, and she was relatively close to where that was.
And as the minutes went by, Darlene's search became more and more frantic.
She is fishing, and she's fishing, and she's fishing. And I mean, she is looking for something.
She couldn't find it because we'd already had it.
With the image of Darlene looking for the murder weapon fresh in the jury's mind, the prosecution rested its case.
That's the kind of evidence you almost never get.
The packed courtroom now waited to hear Darlene's defense, but they wouldn't hear it from her. Her attorney advised her not to take the stand.
If Darlene had testified in the trial, she would have had to answer some questions, which I think might have been very difficult for her to answer.
9 times out of 10, once you get up on the stand, they turn everything around, and it doesn't do you any justice to be up there. It's more harm done than good.
February 8th, 2007. It had been more than a year since Darlene Gentry's husband had been shot in his bed. And now it was up to a jury to determine if the 34-year-old was guilty of murder.
Throughout the trial, there wasn't much anything from her emotion either way. She seemed very calm and a very pretty girl. I called her the cute little blonde mommy.
The prosecution had no witnesses to the crime, but what they did have was a video. Darlene wading around in the pond where police had recovered the probable murder weapon. A place where prosecutors say Darlene had no business being unless she was guilty.
Why on earth is she out in the pond if she isn't looking for the gun? If she knows the gun's there, then she's got to have been involved in the murder.
And what had the defense used to counter the video? The answer was nothing. The defense had rested without so much as a word about the video.
It was ridiculous. It was ridiculous, and everybody was literally looking at each other saying, that's it? That's the best you have?
According to Darlene, she was as surprised as anyone by the move.
When he stood up there and said, you know, we rest, I was in such a total state of shock.
After that film was shown, I mean, he let the jury go, let everybody go with that picture in their mind.
No one knew the whole story. Nobody knew my side of what was happening.
But as the jury deliberated and the hours ticked by, the crowd in the courtroom started to wonder, was the videotape as damaging as the prosecutors hoped?
I don't think the verdict came back until close to 8 o'clock.
A jury's out that long, you sweat it out.
Finally, after 5 hours of deliberation, the jurors reached a verdict. They found Darlene Gentry guilty of murder and sentenced her to 60 years in prison. Immediately after her trial, Darlene filed an appeal for a new trial, claiming the surveillance tape should never have been allowed in court. She says she heard a rumor that the gun had been thrown into the pond. Even at the time, she said she realized it was a mistake.
I remember feeling like, okay, this is wrong. I shouldn't be doing this. Basically, whoever did it, plus the cops set me up, that's why I'm sitting in here today.
Was Darlene set up? Keith's friends and family are doubtful. After all, a rumor could have convinced Darlene to search the pond. But could a rumor tell her precisely where to look?
She went straight to the location where the gun was located.
As far as Keith's family and friends are concerned, sitting in jail is exactly where Darlene belongs.
We were more worried that there was the possibility that she would get off. And I think she was kind of counting on the fact that here she was, this pretty blonde